Here we are with Gold Rush Girl. And I think we're in chapter 10. Yes, chapter 10. So they just passed Rotten Row. We reached the beach, disembarked, and then walked across the sandy waterside. To do so, we had to sidestep discarded carpet bags, crates, casks, and bales, plus sacks of what appeared to be spilled coffee and spilled flour. Beyond that, we reached a wide mud path. Montgomery Street, Father announced. A street? Barely. Not one cobblestone, but merely dirt, reduced in many places to a muddy quagmire. I reached down to touch that I reached down to touch the gummy sludge. This slubber was everywhere, 2 and sometimes 3 feet deep. I, who was too often like a spouting dictionary, was reduced to muteness. As far as I could see, San Francisco did not have any real streets, nothing like Providence. Instead, 2 lanes, 2 feet wide, wound among a hodgepodge of shops, eating houses, plus whatever people called home. There were gambling establishments everywhere I looked, a quantity sufficient to challenge my mathematical reckoning. Nor could I begin to count how many drinking places, saloons, I observed. The air was heavy with whiffs, no, rather clouds of whiskey vapor. As for my ears, they were filled with a constant clamor, sounds of squabbling voices, shouts, and sometimes disturbing screams. Many shops had signs telling what they sold, but in such a litany of languages, I could not begin to guess what they offered. I had the odd sensation that we had arrived not in a different country, but in many different countries, all squashed together. In short, my senses, my sight, hearing, and touch, were disordered. My primary state of mind? Puzzlement. All the same, Jacob and I followed Father up a steep hill, which he chose to call Sacramento Street. In so doing, we were required to avoid broken tubs and chests, as well as thrown away goods and rubbish, including what appeared to be a discarded open iron safe. The lack of storage space, Father explained, required goods to be stored outdoors. Theft, he assured us, I cannot say how he knew, was rare. A few sections of the muck-covered streets had narrow wooden planks upon which to tread. When we stopped on such, they sank into the ooze with a gross sucking sound. The street filth required me to hold up my skirts, which became grimy anyway. The sludge oozed between my toes so that my shoes, I was sure, were ruined. In truth, walking proved so difficult, I resolved that when we got to our new house, my man boots must be used. To my further disgust, I saw a multitude of scurrying rats, gray, black, and white ones with disturbingly pink eyes. Seeing us, these creatures lifted their revolting, bewhiskered snouts without fear and sniffed as we passed, as if to say, "This is our place. What are you doing here?" Adding to this awfulness was the bothersome breeze, which coated all of the dust, enough to thicken my hair. I could feel it happen, and I resolved to wash it as soon as possible. To add to everything, the city truly stank. As we went on, we continually had to make our way around and through crowds that consisted of mostly men. It made me feel odd. What kind of world had I come to? Had women and girls been banished? Yes, the passengers on the Stephanie K had almost all been males, but here was a city full of men, and none appeared older than 30 years of age. I confess, it gave me considerable unease. These men were not attractive. Each man, different perhaps, but they all had in common dirty, ill-kept beards, long, uncut hair that made them look like shabby porcupines. They also dressed much the same, broad-brimmed slouch hats, red or blue flannel shirts, and corduroy trousers tucked into heavy boots. What's more, they carried either a Colt pistol or a knife in their belts, sometimes both. It was as if the city were occupied by a bandit army. There were many others who dressed in somewhat different fashion, I suppose Mexicans and Chinese, and who spoke their own language. Who are all these men? I asked. Miners, murmured Father. Had I made myself clear? I was aghast by what I saw. Where, I wondered, was the spirit of gentle Saint Francis, from whom this city took its name? I confess my courage faltered. I could all but hear. What would Aunt Lavinia say to this? In haste, I scolded myself. I was in San Francisco, thousands of miles from Providence. This was the destiny my will had given me. There was no way I could go back. We must get to our new house, and I would hide away. Jacob was struggling through the mud, and he called out once, twice, 3 times. Are we close? Father said, we need to reach California and Stockton streets. I was finding it hard to believe that there were any streets when Father abruptly announced, here we are, home. Baffled, Jacob and I looked around. What do you mean? I asked. Where? What? Right in front of you, said Father. This tent. A tent? The tent Father pointed to was made of what appeared to be old brown sailor's cloth, patched with enough to have been a beggar's cloak. Its roof was held up by a crooked wooden branch in the middle, so that it was some 5 feet in height. Its walls were kept down by stakes. The inner floor, no more than 8 by 8, was gnawed with dirt. It reminded me of pictures I'd seen of Egyptian pyramids. It might have been as old. Yet Father had called it home. Jacob, his voice full of shock as my thoughts, said, Are we going to live here? Until, said Father, I returned from the gold fields and purchased something better. It cost only $100. He spoke with pride, as if he had made a great bargain. As I would learn, he had. Let it be said that there were many other tents to all sides of ours in which people were living. But not all. Right across from our tent, separated by nothing more than a muddy 20-foot strip, was what appeared to be an eatery. It was, in fact, a huge wooden box, propped open by a number of barrels. Over the open window there was no door, and written words proclaimed, San Francisco Cafe Restaurant. Standing inside this odd structure behind a wooden plank was a man, rather small. He had a leathery dark face and black hair, along with a welcome smile. Bienvenidos, he said from across the way. I am Senor Rosales, and I am glad to have you in nuestro barrio. We shall become amigos. Do you speak Spanish? No. Que triste. It shall be my personal pleasure to teach you. When he spoke, he rolled his R's, so they rumbled softly. The most pleasing sound to touch my ear since I arrived here in San Francisco. Father stepped across the way and shook hands with the man and introduced himself and us. Mr. Randolph Blaisdell, my son, Master Jacob, and my daughter, Miss Victoria. How wonderful, cried the senor. I have 2 children as well. But, senor, he said, his voice suddenly filled with caution, I must tell you, San Francisco is not a good place for los niños. They are like corderos, lambs, not safe. You may be sure there are lobos about, wolves. May I offer you some desayuno, breakfast? He was being so kind, warning us about the city, giving us lessons in Spanish, and offering us breakfast all at once. Thank you, said Father, but we need to move into our new home. I was in fact quite hungry, but we retreated to that tent, our home. That home took a little time to organize. Furnishings consisted of 3 beds, blankets over boards, and our baggage, which was soon delivered at more cost, plus a discarded biscuit box that Jacob found not far off in the muddy street. He dragged it in and set it down in the middle, where it served as a table. All too quickly then, the 3 of us were sitting in the tent, the front flaps down. The air was stifling, the smell rather like a rank washcloth. At first, no one spoke, because, I suspect, we didn't know what to say or do. It was as if we had traveled to X, but had come to Y, and we weren't sure how that happened. That's to say, though we had traveled across the world, we knew not where we were, and we hardly knew what came next. The look on Jacob's face was one of great perplexity. Now and again, he reached out and touched the tent's cloth, as if not believing it was real. Then he would look at Father. Then he would look at me, as if we might have something to say. We did not. Father, though he tried to hide it, seemed equally unsure of himself. More than once, he consulted his pocket watch, as if to suggest he might have an appointment. Most assuredly, he did not. As for me, I was mortified. I realized I believed in a larger-than-life dreams. I, too, I acknowledged, had succumbed to gold fever. Restored to health, I could see that the reality of this was altogether bizarre. Father, I said at last, I am filthy. How am I to wash? Where do we get water? It will need to be fetched. I shall have to purchase some buckets. I looked about. And will I have no privacy? I asked. I shall put up a curtain wall. Next day, Father secured a piece of old sail and strung it across one corner. So much for seclusion. Little that it was, I was thankful. We continued to sit for a while in silence, each of us in our own way, no doubt, trying to make sense of where we were. At length, I said, Father, what shall happen to us? Father pulled himself up, consulted his watch, and said, I've told you many times, I will quickly make my fortune in gold. And then, he faltered. And then what? I asked. He went on to paint an airy picture of the future that seemed to be a replication of what we'd have in Providence, soon to be rebuilt in San Francisco. A sweep of anger went through me. Dear Father, I said, speaking, I fear, like a book heroine in excessive distress, have we come so far over such a long time, at such a great expense and peril, cutting all ties with our past, only to make everything exactly the way we had it before? This world we've come to is different and new, but different and new in the most dreadful of ways. I concluded by saying, nay, demanding yet again, what will become of us? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I have an obligation to your mother to regain our fortunes. I wanted to say, though I did not, but what about us? When I realized that he had no answers, I felt a surge of anger. But as we sat there, my anger subsided, because as I looked at my father, I understood that ire and resentment would do me little good. In its place came the realization that if Jacob and I were to survive, it would be me who needed to care for us. If ever there were a moment when your will shall decide your destiny, this was it. But let it be said, it is one thing to be transported to a different place. It is quite another thing to be transported to a different way of being. Had I not wanted change, well then, vast change was now a necessity. But I had no idea how to make it happen. Wow. That was chapter 10. And now we're on to 11. I'm going to read 11. It's not that long. It's so disappointing that San Francisco was not at all a developed city at that time. And the East Coast was so much more established. So going to the West like that was really such an adventure. And it was really very uncivilized. As soon as we discovered having a tent home in San Francisco was like living atop an anthill that kept having more ants. Each day, hundreds of new people arrived in San Francisco. During our first weeks in the city, 200 more ships arrived and disgorged their passengers. The vessels were added thus to the fleet called the Rotten Row. Daily, 15 to 30 so-called homes were put up in the city, with people moving into them all but instantly. There were never enough new homes. Nor was there, while most indelicate, it must be said, there was no sanitation. Waste was disposed upon the sandy hills or in the bay. The city stank. We used an earthenware chamber pot. I don't wish to say more on this topic. At the beginning of the year, 1849, the city contained less than 2,000 citizens. By the time we arrived, there was something like 15,000. Gold was the magnet for the soul. It reminded me of the saying, where industry walks, greed gallops. Many a newcomer barely came to shore, but rushed off in search of gold down by the bay to what they called the diggings. These people called themselves Argonauts, after those who sought the golden fleece in ancient Egypt and Greece. To mind, these California newcomers were being fleeced. I refused to be. I took it upon myself to purchase food, only to discover that prices were extraordinarily high. For one egg, $1. A potato cost 75 cents. Water, $1 a bucket. What's more, as we quickly learned, there was no easy access to water. We had to fetch it, buy it, and then haul it back to our tent, uphill. All this meant that I soon came to understand that Father had insufficient money for our needs. That led to the further realization that I must secure some money, which is to say, I needed to find work. As you know, I had worked, discreet ladies' work, in Providence. Would I, a girl in San Francisco, even be able to find, and what's more, be allowed to undertake employment? As it happened, because so many men were at the diggings, laborers were scarce. This meant that it turned out to be easy for me to secure some work. I may have been a tall, skinny girl, but I was strong. Most of all, I was willing to learn. I had done so before. As long as I could do the tasks required, nobody minded who I was. There was one major problem: my clothing, my girls' clothing, skirts, blouses, and bonnets made it difficult to work, and they became constantly dirtied. Washing was, at best, a gross challenge, expensive, and endlessly time-consuming. No wonder so many San Francisco men were filthy. From the moment I put my foot on California soil, I too was soiled. Since I had been raised with one of Aunt Lavinia's favorite maxims, cleanliness is next to godliness, this was hard. I was forced to make the decision. I would have to dress in men's garb. Being so clothed would make it easier to work and easier to keep somewhat clean. Not truly clean, but somewhat clean. I therefore purchased baggy corduroy trousers and flannel shirts at the Howard and Mellis, a large dry goods store by the Cove. This clothing allowed me to get through deep mud while saving hours of washing clothes. It had little to nothing to do with hiding who I was. It merely allowed me to labor. Another thing. During my first days in the city, when I walked about my girls' dresses, many a miner approached and rudely asked me to marry him. You must be sure it wasn't love that brought these proposals about, but I realized a desire to have a servant. My man's costume put an end to such absurd insults. I also kept my hair in one long braid, taking my style from the Chinese men. So it was that within a week upon our arrival, I was pushing wheelbarrows through deep mud. I learned to row, about which more I will tell you later. I borrowed a rowboat to help me unload newly arrived ships and bring luggage and passengers to land. It paid well, though it did give me, at first, hand blisters. It also helped carpenters or newcomers put up I also helped carpenters or newcomers put up framed houses and cover them with canvas, cotton, or paper. This is to say, I put my hands to do whatever paid me. By doing so, I made as much as $10 a day or more, 10 times more than what I earned in Providence. Oddly enough, the men for whom I worked paid me with grains of gold, not coin, because there wasn't much real money around. That made me smile. Here was Father about to seek gold at the diggings, while I was already acquiring gold by working in the city. I had more wealth than I ever thought possible, much more than Father had at that point. All of this enhanced my sense of freedom. Doing what was required meant I grew physically and mentally stronger every day, while onerous tasks became easier. Here was a new kind of spirited life, a new me. Could any heroine ask for more? Was this difficult? To be sure. You may believe I was truly required to live the notion I would rather be happy than dignified. Let it be admitted, I had little dignity. Let it also be said that I enjoyed the independence. I think my working and my way of dressing was an embarrassment to Father. No doubt he barely recognized me. Well then, we hardly recognized him. He started to dress like a miner, complete with red flannel shirt, slouch hat, and boots. He even grew a beard. He spent all his time learning what he must do and where to go while purchasing the tools he needed for the diggings. Father, the most placid of men, now had a knife in his belt. I doubt he even knew how to use it. In Providence, before he lost his position, he had been, as I previously described him, a careful, non-adventurous man. Announcing that he was now merely days and a little effort away from acquiring colossal wealth, he thought only of gold. This was not unusual. If gold fever was an illness on the East Coast, in San Francisco, it was a plague. Beyond all else, Father, who had been a most thoughtful, if restrictive parent, now showed us, his children, almost no attention at all. For the most part, he left us alone, telling us he was looking for servants and looking for a school for Jacob. In all of this, only Jacob stayed the same. Whereas I had begun to work, Jacob was at a loss for what to do. At first, he tried to follow Father about. Father shooed him away. Then he tried to join me where I was working. That proved impossible. As a result, he wandered aimlessly, though never far from our tent. It was plainly clear that Jacob much preferred to be taken care of, not wishing to make choices for himself, not willing to bestir himself. I was struck with this truth, that as a sister grows older, her brother seems to grow younger. The most useful thing Jacob did was befriend our across-the-way neighbor, Senor Rosales. The good man was ever patient as Jacob chattered and tried to help him. As for me, Senor Rosales called me Corderita, which I understood to mean little lamb. A few days before Father headed for the diggings, we sat in the tent around the box that was our table, the sole light coming from a small solitary and smoky candle. As we ate our dinner, a slab of beef, which I had cooked outside over a fire, Father abruptly turned to me and said, "Tori, I trust you understand. When I leave, it's all good and well that you are working, but your chief responsibility is to take care of Jacob." Taken by surprise, I echoed, "Chief? Of course. You are his sister, 4 years older than he. That makes you in charge. I have tried to hire a servant. None are to be had at the wages we paid back east. And I am afraid to say there seems to be no school here." Let it be said that the notion that henceforward I was to be the sole person responsible for Jacob was hardly pleasing to me. Once again, this was not what I had envisioned in coming west. Jacob's angry face made it clear that it is not what he desired either. He argued with Father, begging him to let us go to the gold fields with him. Father refused. "I'm depending on you," Father continued to say to me, "to take care of your brother. Mother is depending on it. Is that understood?" No doubt I nodded, but I was thinking not about Jacob, but about myself. Here I was, a 14-year-old girl who had just begun to enjoy full freedom. Though Jacob surely was my dear brother, I cannot say I wanted to engage my time being a nursemaid to him. Yet I had to acknowledge this was, in part, my own doing. If I had not come to San Francisco, surely Father would have taken Jacob with him. There was nothing I could say. Even so, with Father about to leave us alone in San Francisco, I had made an important decision. I would not give up my new life for my brother. And that's chapter 12. So, wow, the father's going to leave now and leave them alone in San Francisco. She's only 14. It's crazy. So it's going to get even more exciting, right? Anyway, hope you guys are enjoying it. Post your comments. I want to hear what you think. Hope you're all doing well. I'll read again soon.